You haven't done it in 30 years or 26 years.
Well, I've been a senator,
You haven't done it.
And
You haven't
I
done it.
have been a Secretary of State, and I have
Your husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, you go anywhere you want, Secretary Clinton, and you will see devastation where manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere.
Donald Trump scored big points on the 2016 campaign when he called out Secretary Hillary Clinton in this exchange. During an election in which America First was an ascending feeling among voters, Trump pinned one of the largest international trade deals in history on his opponent. The fact that Hillary's husband, President Bill Clinton, had signed the deal into law in 1993 made it hard to escape the charge.
That is just not accurate.
2016 was a complicated election, but I think it's fair to say that generally speaking, voters came to see Hillary Clinton as the free trade candidate.
We are 5% of the world's population. We have to trade with the other 95%.
And Trump as the protectionist candidate.
We will withdraw from NAFTA and start all over.
Once in office, presidents tend to become less dogmatic about the issue. After all, trade can also be a useful tool in high-stakes international negotiations.
Just this week, we secured a wonderful deal with South Korea, and I may hold it up till after a deal is made with North Korea, because it's a very strong card.
Though protectionism has always been a strong force in American politics, the doctrine of free trade has gone largely unchallenged by every president, Republican and Democrat, since World War II.
Jerry Ford made the best comment on this. He once said that when he and John Kennedy were in the Congress, neither had a perfect record on trade. But when each became president, they became free traders. That is the picture you see at 10,000 feet when you're president of the United States.
Now in 2020, President Trump has taken aim at free trade once again, flaunting Democratic Party candidate Joe Biden's past support for NAFTA.
My problem is I voted for NAFTA.
It's easy now to think of the Democratic Party as symbolizing NAFTA, but the idea for creating the world's largest free trade zone was introduced to most Americans by a Republican candidate for president in 1979.
And so a developing closeness among Canada, Mexico, and the United States, a North American accord, would permit achievement of that potential in each country beyond that which I believe any of us, strong as we are, could accomplish in the presence or the absence, I should say, of such cooperation.
This loosely articulated Continental Alliance was the basis for what eventually became the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. It was dreamed up by Reagan, negotiated by George H.W. Bush, and signed into law during the first year of the Clinton administration. Now, after almost 20 years, NAFTA is associated with the decline of American domestic industry and the rapid rise of economic inequality. Throughout this time, workers' unions have been at the forefront of the opposition to unfettered international trade, and it's no wonder. For as this dive into the origins of NAFTA will show, it took a war on workers to make this deal a reality.
And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
It's fitting that on Labor Day we meet beside the harbors, the waters, I should say, of New York Harbor, with the eyes of Miss Liberty on our gathering.
Ronald Reagan kicked off his campaign for president on Labor Day 1980, standing on the docks of the Hudson River in Jersey City, New Jersey. It was an odd choice for a Republican.
Hudson County is the home of Democrats in such great numbers. No, and I hope a lot are here. I'm here because it is the home of Democrats, because I believe today that in this country there are millions of Democrats who are just as unhappy with the way things are as all the rest of us are.
Many would have accused him of wasting his time, but Reagan had reason to believe that some Democrats may be open to his platform. Years of stagnation, massive inflation, as well as skyrocketing oil prices had paralyzed the American economy for the duration of the 1970s. The ongoing disaster prompted sitting President Jimmy Carter to deliver an emergency address from his Oval Office.
I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. It is a crisis of confidence. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
But Carter's crisis of confidence went well beyond economics. For President Carter, the crisis was a spiritual one as well, one in which the American people would need to reevaluate their relationship to consumerism.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. And I'm asking you, for your good and for your nation's security, to take no unnecessary trips, to use carpools or public transportation whenever you can, to park your car 1 extra day per week, to obey the speed limit, and to set your thermostats to save fuel.
Carter's speech is one of the most candid in history and received positive reviews the night he delivered it. But the celebration was short-lived. Carter's rivals painted his address as a kind of defeatist manifesto, particularly politicians like Ronald Reagan.
Jimmy Carter's administration tells us that the descendants of those who sacrificed to start again in this land of freedom may have to abandon the dream that drew their ancestors to a new life in a new land. You're right.
Behind the scenes, Reagan consolidated support among business leaders and employers with his promises of low corporate taxes and massive deregulation. In public, he advertised his policies as empowering the average worker.
We're talking about jobs and productivity and wages. We're talking about doing away with Jimmy Carter's view of a no-growth policy, an ever-shrinking economic pie, which means smaller slices for every one of us. We can have a bigger pie, and that'll mean bigger slices for every one of us.
Reagan's arguments held sway with a lot of Americans who felt like President Carter had shifted the blame for the country's economic woes off himself and onto the American people. While Carter urged Americans to look forward toward how to survive in a future of scarcity, Reagan prompted Americans to look backward to the times when the U.S. was a strong country, and to believe we could revive that spirit with a now familiar refrain.
This country needs a new administration with a renewed dedication to the dream of an America, an administration that will give that dream new life and make America great again.
Appealing to the working class by promising to cut corporate taxes and deregulate industries may seem counterintuitive. Why would workers go to the polls for a candidate whose programs are primarily directed at helping their bosses? Well, Reagan believed that low taxes on corporations, along with massive deregulation, would help revive American industry and thus create more jobs for working people. Reagan's idea of boosting industry so that the effects of success might trickle down to the working classes did little to sway most unions. But Reagan's ideas did translate to the union rank and file, especially his cultural conservatism. The Reagan campaign zeroed in on Carter's support of affirmative action, and, despite the fact that Carter was pro-life, his compromises with abortion activists. Reagan, the divorced B actor from California, was even able to snake evangelical support from Jimmy Carter, a born-again Christian who taught Sunday school every Sunday.
The most important thing in my life is Jesus Christ.
There you go again.
For many hard hat-wearing cultural conservatives, Ronald Reagan was the more appealing choice. And if he was promising to make America great again, many recession-weary workers were ready to give the new guy a shot. It was the birth of the Reagan Democrat, and in 1980, no one personified this emerging voter constituency better than the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO. Most of PATCO's members were Vietnam vets, rough-edged and politically incorrect, They resented the scolding liberalism of what we would now call identity politics. In a time when activists battled for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution and affirmative action programs to address racial inequality, the predominantly white workers in unions like PATCO became disillusioned with the left, and thus vulnerable to the appeals of right-wing politicians, who seemed to have common sense and who confirmed their anxieties that a rapidly progressing culture was leaving them behind. Conditions at the job added to their stresses. Controllers in the U.S. worked longer hours for less pay and vacation than their international counterparts. Airplane crashes in the 70s were at an all-time high, and overworked controllers complained of nightmares induced by the stress of the job. In the past, PATCO had battled the FAA with slowdowns. These were organized actions aimed at slowing down air traffic to cut into the airline's profits. Tactics included making sure planes landed and completely turned before the next plane took off. This massively slowed down air traffic and annoyed travelers. When the FAA complained, the controllers countered that they were simply following FAA guidelines to the letter. This had the dual effect of exposing how many shortcuts the FAA were taking to increase air traffic. PATCO's actions were actually making air traffic safer. In battles like these, PATCO won unprecedented concessions and soon gained a reputation as one of the most militant and radical unions in the country. In the 1960s, they'd forced President Lyndon Johnson to sign a bill exempting restrictions on overtime pay for workers. They'd pushed President Nixon to sign a bill giving controllers full retirement benefits after the age of 50. But PATCO's winning streak began hitting more snags as the U.S. settled into the massive recession of the 1970s. Their relationship with President Carter was particularly strained. In 1976, while courting PATCO's endorsement, Carter had promised support for a bill allowing federal unions to negotiate for better pay. Carter promptly broke his promise once in office, citing the economic crisis. Later, he refused to support a bill giving air traffic controllers guaranteed early retirement benefits and legal immunity from crashes. However, when a sharply dressed smooth talker from California approached the union in 1980 with what sounded like a better deal, they threw their support behind Ronald Reagan. It was a decision that, in the end, would facilitate PATCO's downfall. Reagan won the 1980 election in a landslide, and PATCO quickly began negotiating with the FAA for a reduced 32-hour workweek, a $10,000 pay increase, and better benefits, hoping the new president would have their backs. Reagan was busy negotiating his own economic package with Congress. On February 18th, Reagan announced his economic stimulus proposal, which included massive cuts in spending on social programs and environmental regulations. And he soon began delivering speeches to accrue support among interest groups. On March 30th, 1981, the new president delivered a speech to the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest trade union, at the Washington Hotel. Far from promising a bigger slice of the pie for everyone, Reagan came to inform the working class that the time to tighten their belts had come.
I've gotten tens of thousands of letters about our plan for economic recovery, but a few of them really stand out, and this man's letter is one of them. He wrote to say that if spending cuts in government affect his benefits, it'll be hard for his family, but they'll make it.
So much for bigger slices of the pie for everyone.
And together, we'll make America great again. Thank you very much.
As Reagan finished his speech that afternoon and headed out of the Washington Hotel, one of those once-in-a-lifetime random occurrences upon which history so often turns took place.
Shots were fired, apparently at President Reagan as he was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon. He was wounded. My God.
The president was rushed to Washington Hospital, where he underwent surgery to remove a bullet lodged near his heart. As the president underwent the anesthesia, he turned to the doctors and famously said, "I hope you're all Republicans." In the end, much to the nation's relief, Reagan recovered from the attack and gave a triumphal oration upon his return to Congress in April.
I have a letter with me. Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, "I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas."
Reagan's brush with death and his good humor gave him a sense of inevitability, which would come in handy as the president quickly turned to political matters.
Now, let's talk about getting spending and inflation under control and cutting your tax rates.
In a highly partisan speech, Reagan extolled the virtues of his tax and spending cuts to a Congress which would now be under heavy pressure to support a president who was now seen as a hero. Reagan's budget bill passed the Congress on August 4th, but the headlines were dominated by a much different story. Negotiations between PATCO and the FAA had gone on all summer and continually failed, and on August 3rd, 1981, they declared a strike. The president's response was swift.
I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
PATCO remained undeterred. On August 4th, thousands of workers stayed home. Many stood out with signs along the airport sidewalk to spread awareness of their cause. PATCO banked heavily on support from other unions, but the support never came. And if they'd hoped to rally public opinion to their side, just think about how angry people get at the airport when their flight has been canceled.
I really think they're overpaid, and it's all unnecessary.
They deserve everything they can get. Strikes bother me.
I'm here on business. I'd hate to be trapped up in Norfolk for a long time.
PATCO believed it had something else working in its favor. Air traffic control is a dangerous and high-skilled job. It was highly unlikely the FAA would be able to replace the striking workers.
And believe me, I mean that sincerely. You 20,000 applicants, my job's available. I've been fired. Give it a try. And I'd like to talk to you in about 5 years and see how you feel then.
But it quickly became obvious that there were more than enough applicants willing to take the jobs the strikers had walked off of.
Applications for air traffic controller has been nonstop.
When I heard they were on strike, I thought, well, it's an opportunity.
The FAA was flooded with job applications, and hopefuls were now forced to sign a pledge that they would never engage in a strike.
Mike Hotchkiss is another prospective controller who says he can live with the stress and the no-strike provision.
Well, it's something you live with. If you take the job, that's one of the things you put up with.
It was beginning to look more and more like PATCO had severely overplayed its hand. When Reagan's 48-hour deadline passed, 11,000 striking employees were fired. After decades of presidents being beholden to unions like PATCO, Reagan was signaling that a new sheriff was in town, and big business quickly reacted. Within a year, teacher strikes fell 42%, and in the state of New York, worker strikes were down 90%. In 1983, the Phelps Dodge copper mine began instituting layoffs and pay cuts in a ploy to goad their workers into striking. When the miners inevitably struck, Arizona sent in the military to break the strike, arresting several miners for rioting. Soon after, elections were held on whether to dissolve the union. With members excluded from participating, it was a landslide in favor of Phelps Dodge, and the mine was reopened, union-free. In 1985, Hormel busted the United Food and Commercial Workers Union by subjecting workers to massive pay cuts and speed-ups until the UFCW broke. With the example of the busting of PATCO and the gutting of business regulations under Reagan, big industry gained a freedom in busting unions never seen since the Gilded Age. With union resistance out of the way, the Reagan administration was free to pursue an even bigger goal: NAFTA.
For most of the last 40 years, we've been preoccupied with the global struggle, the competition with the Soviet Union, and with our responsibilities to our allies. But too often in recent times, we've just drifted along with events, responding as if we thought of ourselves as a nation in decline. To our allies, we seem to appear to be a nation unable to make decisions in its own interests, let alone in the common interest.
In 1979, former California Governor Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for president in a 30-minute infomercial-style segment that aired on primetime TV. One of his stated reasons for running this campaign was a fear that the United States was losing its place in the world. The economy was in shambles, and traumatic memories of America's failed crusade for democracy in Vietnam still lingered in the minds of many Americans. An extremely critical view of U.S. foreign policy resulting from the Vietnamese War had set in among a large part of the populace. Reagan saw reversing what many called the Vietnam syndrome as a vital plank in his plan to make America great again. But Reagan's battle to return his country to the dominant position he believed it had lost under the Carter presidency would be waged largely on the economic front. Booming industries in Japan and Korea were outpacing declining American industry. The US was exporting less and losing customers abroad. In the Middle East, countries formed regional trade conglomerates like OPEC. And in the 1970s, OPEC had managed to coordinate a massive hike in oil prices, in part as a sanction of the United States for its military activities in the region. The dramatic overthrowing of the US-backed Iranian Shah and the founding of an Islamic Republic echoed further defiance against America's assumed role as the world's police. World War II had made the United States a leader. Now it seemed those days were coming to an end. It's no surprise, then, that Reagan would so often quote Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
And like those past presidents, Reagan would seek America's salvation by reaching out beyond its borders.
The 1970s have taught us the foolhardiness of not having a long-range diplomatic strategy of our own. The world has become a place where, in order to survive, our country needs more than just allies. It needs real friends.
And what better place to find friends than in your own backyard?
We live on a continent whose 3 countries possess the assets to make it the strongest, most prosperous, and self-sufficient area on Earth. Within the borders of this North American continent are the food, resources, technology, and undeveloped territory which, properly managed, could dramatically improve the quality of life of all its inhabitants.
Reagan placed these remarks towards the latter half of his speech, and he may have done so on purpose. His views on taxes, regulations, and cultural issues, touted during the first half of the speech, sufficiently demonstrated Reagan's credit as a conservative. But it was all just a spoonful of sugar for the medicine he was about to have his conservative audience swallow.
The key to our own future security may lie in both Mexico and Canada becoming much stronger countries than they are today. And so a developing closeness among Canada, Mexico, and the United States, a North American accord, would permit achievement of that potential in each country beyond that which I believe any of us, strong as we are, could accomplish in the presence, or the absence, I should say, of such cooperation.
As president, Reagan took the initial steps toward pursuing this trade alliance, opening talks with both Canada and Mexico's governments. By the end of his 8 years in office, Reagan had set the groundwork for the deal, but NAFTA was still a long way away from being completed. In his later speeches, Reagan almost regretfully mused about his yet unrealized plan for a continental system.
You know, some time ago, way back in those prehistoric times known as the 70s, I called for what I named a North American Accord that would embrace our whole continent, the United States, Canada, and Mexico as well. I said then that it's time we stopped thinking of our nearest neighbors as foreigners. Let us instead think of them as partners, independent and sovereign, but united in a common purpose.
Reagan's vision resembled something akin to open borders, and indeed that phrase was bandied about among early think tanks and Reagan advisors. Open borders had not yet taken on the connotation it has today.
Under her plan, you have open borders. You would have a disaster on trade, and you will have a disaster with your open borders.
We will not have open borders. This used to be a bipartisan issue. Ronald Reagan was the last president to sign immigration reform.
Indeed, far from calling for closing the U.S. border, the president who famously told Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall wanted to tear down diplomatic and trade barriers across the world.
We're tearing down the walls, the tariffs that block the flow of trade, and eliminating the tangle of restrictions and regulations that bind our commerce and inhibit economic cooperation.
And as if Reagan hadn't scared the protectionist wing of his party enough with statements like that, his long-term vision for a globally interdependent society would give John Lennon's Imagine a run for its money.
I say now, it's time to dream even bigger dreams. Dreams of an entire hemisphere, from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego, united by the bonds of democracy and free trade, an entire hemisphere in which all the borders become what the U.S.-Canadian border is today, a meeting place rather than a dividing line.
You would have a disaster on trade, and you will have a disaster with your open borders.
The sentiments expressed by Donald Trump in this clip would line up neatly with how working people would come to view the free trade policies pursued by Reagan and his successors over the coming 4 decades. Sure, free trade promised jobs by making the U.S. more competitive on the global market. But what kind of jobs would it create? Without strong union power, how could workers be guaranteed living wages and benefits? And what would stop American companies from outsourcing jobs to Mexico, where regulations were much less strict and wages much lower? Concerns like these would be amplified as future presidents attempted to complete the alliance that Reagan had dreamed up so many years ago.
Beautiful day. Beautiful day.
As is customary in recent years, the party out of the White House has asked, and it has been given, broadcast time to air views on the State of the Union from the Democratic side of the aisle.
Speaking for the Democratic Party tonight will be Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas.
Our objective tonight is not to disagree with our president and his party, though our differences are many. Like all Americans, we must celebrate any success that builds a better future. And we believe Democrats should work with Republicans to ensure that kind of future.
In the age of Reagan, a new kind of Democratic politician was on the rise in Arkansas. Bill Clinton, a young, energetic governor, was a rising star, but one somewhat out of touch with the prevailing wisdom of his party, as evidenced by his infamous appearance at the 1988 Democratic Convention.
Even though we know that 80% of the workforce in the year 2000 is already working, and we know that when workers can't read, eventually they'll have to pay for it, and we will too.
In a party that had staked its opposition to Reaganism on principles of protecting social welfare and other New Deal policies, Bill Clinton's reach across the aisle approach was initially a tough sell.
I'm in the New Jersey delegation, and I can tell you that this place is just ready to explode, and I think that they're long past the period, Tom, of listening to Governor Bill Clinton.
But outside of the convention halls, Bill Clinton's brand of politics was gaining steam. When Bill Clinton was first elected governor of the conservative state of Arkansas, he employed a standard-issue liberal Democratic platform. Arkansas voters handed him a loss in 1980. But Clinton came back in 1982, chastened by his defeat 2 years prior. This time Clinton had a much more conservative platform. Clinton remained the governor of Arkansas until just prior becoming president of the United States in 1993. As Reagan did battle with the nation's unions, Clinton walked a fine line which often left the unions wanting. He lost endorsements from teachers' unions over his mandatory testing programs and alienated timber workers and environmental lobbyists by opening up more land to loggers. J. Bill Becker of the state's AFL-CIO saw Clinton as an inveterate compromiser.
The governor generally takes the path of least resistance. He's pretty slick.
Though Slick Willie, as he would come to be known, did pursue standard Democratic tax policies, raising them across the board to increase social spending in the state, his tax rates favored corporations and other high-income taxpayers. By any measure, Governor Clinton was running a micro version of trickle-down economics in his own state. The tax hikes brought in needed funds for social programs, yet by the end of Clinton's term, the government of Arkansas still spent less money on its people than any other state in the Union. Clinton's state saw massive job growth during his time in office, a fact which would become the basis of his campaign. Clinton conveniently left out the fact that these were mostly low-paying jobs. Arkansas had the lowest wages in the country. Another sign of how deeply the bargaining power of the working class had been diminished in the age of Reagan. 1988 saw a massive defeat for the Democrats with the election of George H.W. Bush. As Ronald Reagan's vice president, Bush's elevation to the presidency amounted to a third term for Ronald Reagan. Once, under FDR and Truman, Democrats dominated the White House for 20 years. Would Ronald Reagan's coalition now do the same? Perhaps a new kind of Democrat was needed.
In my state, when people lose their jobs, there's a good chance I'll know them by their names. And I've been out here for 13 months, meeting in meetings just like this ever since October, with people like you all over America. People that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, lost their health insurance. It is because America has not invested in its people. It is because we have not grown. It is because we've had 12 years of trickle-down economics.
Clinton's vague economic populism and I feel your pain charisma painted a sharp contrast to President Bush. And that vagueness would extend to Clinton's stance on NAFTA as well. During his 4 years in office, President Bush had painstakingly hashed out the framework for a North American free trade agreement. The date for signing would fall within the first year of the next president's term, which meant Clinton needed a stance on the issue. Clinton had been known as a pioneer of foreign investment within his own state of Arkansas, but in campaigning for national office, Clinton tried to evade the subject. However, in private town halls with AFL unions, Clinton persuaded workers to accept the inevitability of NAFTA, but to support Democrats for a more worker-friendly version of the deal.
I know that Americans, especially here in California, in Texas, are concerned about trade with a low-wage economy like Mexico. But I have a secret for you. This is all happening now, before NAFTA has gone into effect. You and I can argue about whether NAFTA will have a positive effect or a negative effect, but here's one thing I can tell you. Everything that you are afraid of happening with NAFTA is already happening. That's God's honest truth.
With President Bush all in, and Bill Clinton's position ambiguous, the 1992 presidential field was left open to a third-party candidate, one who would articulate the concerns of those working people who worried that a deal like NAFTA would leave them behind. He was a flamboyant billionaire from Texas named Ross Perot.
Pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
That giant sucking sound, by the way, refers to all the employment opportunity in the United States getting sucked away by Mexico, which is what Ross Perot said would happen if America signed this trade deal. With his anti-NAFTA agenda in tow, Ross Perot would upset the 1992 election as a third-party candidate, running on the Reform Party ticket. Future Reform Party candidates for president would include Pat Buchanan, as well as a New York real estate magnate named Donald Trump. Perot was an unscripted, wily character who often garnered headlines with his unorthodox and blunt statements.
Now, a good deal will sell itself, folks, just plain talk. This dog just didn't hunt.
Perot insisted the Mexicans did not have the purchasing power to buy American goods.
People who don't make anything can't buy anything. Let's start with that. We are 85% of the market. Canada is 11% of the buying power.
Of the total 3 markets.
And Mexico is only 4%. People who don't make anything cannot buy anything. Never forget that.
Opening a free trade zone would mean massive outsourcing of jobs to Mexico and little return in terms of Mexicans buying American exports.
U.S. companies, because it is so difficult to do business in this country, can't wait to get out of this country and go somewhere else, and, if possible, get labor that costs 1/7 of what it costs in the United States. Change?
On Election Day 1992, Perot garnered 20% of the popular vote, an unprecedentedly massive showing. Perot had siphoned off voters from both parties, but the more traditionally protectionist Republican Party had flocked to Perot in much greater numbers than the Democrats. When the results came in on the first Tuesday in November 1992, Governor Bill Clinton had been elected the 42nd President of the United States. Bill Clinton's inauguration was a party like no other. The first boomer president represented a generational shift in American politics. At times, January 20th, 1993 looked more like Woodstock than a presidential inauguration. But Clinton's honeymoon would be short-lived. Whereas Reagan's smooth transition to power and dramatic survival of an assassin's bullet would set an heroic tone for his first 100 days, Clinton's first 100 days would be awash with controversy. Riddled with scandals and tabloid disasters, Clinton's initial forays into the presidency made him look weak in character and indecisive. This left him highly vulnerable to his opposition in Congress and toxic to those Democrats who would otherwise back him to the hilt. Clinton's first major piece of legislation, a bill to balance the budget, barely passed the Congress and made it through with no Republican votes. Barely finished with his first year in office, Bill Clinton was already looking like a failed president, sapped of political capital. But he was about to be handed a gift from the other side of the aisle. In the months before leaving office, President Bush had signed a preliminary NAFTA agreement to be ratified by the Congress and signed by the president no later than December 1993. Clinton, badly in need of a bipartisan victory, and not personally averse to the deal himself, saw a chance to demonstrate, for the first time in his presidency, decisive bipartisan leadership. Clinton worked hard to line up the votes in both houses, many of which came from Reaganite free trade Republicans. On September 13th, Clinton expanded the bipartisan case for NAFTA by gathering all the living ex-presidents in a show of support for the treaty. Still, the administration felt it had one obstacle left to contend with: Ross Perot. Having received a huge chunk of the popular vote, Perot's voice was still widely listened to throughout the country. And that November, he'd agreed to appear on Larry King Live alongside Vice President Al Gore for a debate on NAFTA. Perot presented all of his usual arguments, dramatically brandishing visual aids to solidify his points. However, Al Gore proved extremely adept at meeting Perot's challenge. Noting Perot's penchant for petulance, Gore spoke deliberately, almost pedagogically.
This is a picture of Mr. Smoot and Mr. Hawley. They look like pretty good fellas. The Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Protection Bill. They raised tariffs, and it was one of the principal causes, many economists say the principal cause, of the Great Depression. I framed this so you can put it on your wall if you want to.
Thank you.
Which annoyed Mr. Perot and sent him into a hizzy.
I can't unless you let me finish. How can I answer if you keep interrupting?
Go ahead.
Will I be able to speak for a second or two from time to time? I don't interrupt. May I finish? I would really like to finish. I don't interrupt him.
This was about all most Americans would remember about the debate. As he had on the campaign trail, Clinton noted that the world was becoming more global, and the U.S. could either compete or retreat. On November 20th, 1993, the treaty passed both houses, and a few weeks later, Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement into law. It was greeted with almost universal praise from both sides. Even Republican Newt Gingrich, who had been one of Clinton's most vocal critics, sang the praises of the Clinton administration.
This is a vote for history, larger than politics, larger than re-election, larger than personal ego.
NAFTA would prove to be one of the high points of the Bill Clinton administration. Few agreements have represented the bipartisan consensus on trade better than NAFTA, but far fewer people agree on the effects. Today's free trade economists will talk about how the breaking down of trade barriers led to cheaper products for consumers. But NAFTA also created a trade imbalance that saw Americans buying more products from abroad. The drop in demand at home led to major job losses here in America, especially in the industrial sector, states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. All states which voted for Obama in 2012, but not Hillary Clinton in 2016. But has Donald Trump kept his promise to withdraw from NAFTA? Not really. Trump's USMCA trade deal changed little of the fundamentals of NAFTA, and like NAFTA, passed with strong bipartisan support. Like his predecessors, Trump has clouded all his actions on trade in the hemisphere with the ever-present promise of jobs.
I will be the greatest jobs producer that God ever created.
Now, as voters look toward the 2020 election, both candidates offer better trade deals and more jobs. Yet many have a sense that no matter who they pick, nothing will fundamentally change. Whoever becomes president in 2021 will see trade, as Gerald Ford said, from 10,000 feet, not from the ground level like working people. In a country where only 11% of workers belong to unions, how can the working class ever have a significant influence on trade negotiations? As factories close, economic inequality rises, and resentment grows. Automation threatens even more jobs. And it's at times like these, when the working class has been sapped of so much of its power, that all anyone can think to do is send a big middle finger to the establishment.